Have you ever wondered what a human being felt when hunger was not just an inconvenience, but a permanent shadow following every step, every breath, every night that refused to end? Imagine standing in a world where food was not a guarantee, but a distant reward, and where every decision was shaped by the raw need to survive. 300,000 years ago, the first humans lived inside this relentless pressure, and yet, in the middle of this struggle, something unexpected emerged. A sense that hunger itself carried a sacred message, a warning, a sign that guided their next movement. This is the moment where instinct, intuition, and a silent spiritual awareness began to merge into one single force. When these early humans looked at the landscape, they were not just seeing the absence of food, they were reading signals. A shift in the wind, the sudden silence of birds, the way the ground held tracks that were too fresh or too old. Everything could mean survival or disaster. Hunger sharpened the senses to the edge of the impossible, creating a new kind of perception that went beyond physical needs. It awakened a feeling that the world spoke to them, that something invisible whispered through the environment, urging them to move, to wait, to stay close, or to flee. This invisible dialogue between human and nature slowly became a spiritual experience, even before the word spirituality existed. In these moments, a sacred message seemed to form inside their minds, not as a voice or a prophecy, but as a deep internal pull. Hunger pushed them into a state where logic and instinct fused, where every signal from the earth felt like part of a larger pattern. They learned to trust these sensations, believing that ignoring them could cost lives. And maybe you have felt something similar yourself, a subtle intuition telling you what to do even when everything feels uncertain. You already know how powerful this internal signal can be, and for them, it was the difference between life and death. And before we move on, tell me something. Have you ever ignored a feeling that later proved to be right? Share your experience in the comments, because understanding how we sense the world is part of what connects us across thousands of generations. Also, make sure to leave your like and check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because it truly helps this kind of content reach more people who value the depth of our shared human story. Now let us keep following this path of silent messages carved by hunger, as the next part reveals how this force shaped the earliest layers of human awareness. Hunger was not just a sensation for early humans. It was a constant presence, shaping the rhythm of every day and every night, influencing how they moved, how they thought, and even how they perceived reality. When the stomach remained empty for too long, the body reacted, but so did the mind. Their awareness stretched outward, scanning the world with an intensity that people today rarely experience. In the harshness of a world without certainty, hunger became the sharpest tool for survival, forcing them into a heightened state of observation where nothing could be ignored. Every rustle in the distance, every shift in the color of the sky, every pattern in the behavior of animals held meaning. Hunger made them read these changes as if the world were an enormous living map. Their bodies grew lighter, their movements more deliberate, their thinking more instinctive. When the pressure of survival intensified, something else awakened. A deeper connection to the environment, a natural form of intelligence shaped entirely by necessity. This was not a poetic idea for them. It was the difference between finding food or collapsing before the next sunrise. As hunger stretched over days, their perception of time shifted. Hours felt longer, sounds felt sharper, and the boundary between the physical and the intuitive grew thin. In this state, early humans felt an internal push, guiding them toward places where food might appear. They could sense when a path was dangerous or when a valley held recent traces of prey. Their bodies and minds worked together in a way we can barely imagine now, creating a kind of awareness that fused instinct with a raw, emerging spiritual sensitivity. This extreme condition did not only sharpen their senses, it created a profound internal dialogue. Hunger forced them to confront vulnerability, but it also awakened creativity. They learned to interpret the world through layers of meaning that went beyond what the eyes could see. Firelight, shadows, smells, the texture of the soil under their feet, all became part of a larger system of signs. They discovered patterns in migration, learned to predict the movement of herds, and recognized the subtle indicators of seasonal changes long before modern reasoning evolved. What began as a physical necessity slowly transformed into a foundation for collective memory. The lessons learned in hunger were repeated, practiced, retold, and absorbed into the identity of their groups. Hunger shaped not just the body, but the emerging consciousness of an entire species. And as this awareness expanded, it paved the way for something even more complex. The first attempts to understand the invisible forces they believed surrounded them, guiding them toward survival when everything felt uncertain. This connection between scarcity and meaning would soon take the form of rituals, signs, and interpretations that define the earliest expressions of human spirituality, and it is from this fragile yet powerful beginning that the next part of our journey unfolds. As hunger carved its way through the fabric of early human life, something remarkable began to form in the silence between meals. Ritual. These were not ceremonies as we know them today, but deeply instinctive patterns of movement and behavior, often triggered by environmental cues and the subtle rhythms of survival. In a world without writing, without speech as we understand it, and without structured religion, these rituals became the first method by which early humans communicated with the unknown. And that unknown, for them, was both terrifying and sacred. They did not bow to gods, not yet. But they paused, they waited, they repeated. Certain stones were never touched. Some areas were avoided for reasons no one questioned. Paths were traced with footsteps that echoed the past. When our prey disappeared, they lit fires in specific formations or gathered silently in caves, placing their hands on walls, smearing pigments from the earth in ways they couldn't explain but always remembered. These actions became habits. Habits became traditions. And in time, traditions became something more, the seeds of belief. In the grip of hunger, when death seemed near and hope grew thin, these rituals offered a kind of invisible structure. They gave purpose to waiting. They gave meaning to the unpredictable. If they burned the right leaves, if they sat in a circle facing the right direction, maybe the animals would return. If they stayed silent under the moonlight, maybe they would not be seen by predators. These weren't superstitions. Not to them. These were strategies shaped by trial and error and eventually reinforced by results. Even if those results were only coincidences, they were enough. Through repetition, patterns formed. Patterns meant memory. Memory meant survival. These early rituals evolved as responses to hunger, but they carried something deeper, a belief that unseen forces could be acknowledged, perhaps even influenced. When food appeared after a specific gesture, the gesture was preserved. When a member of the group dreamed of a river and the next day they found water, dreams became significant. They didn't separate reality from imagination as we do now. For them, both lived in the same space. It was in these ritualistic behaviors that early humans began to develop a symbolic language, one not based on words, but on actions and meanings passed from body to body, generation to generation. Ritual became the first theater of memory, performed under pressure, shaped by hunger, and directed toward the invisible. These gestures, repeated under duress, built the earliest scaffolding for what would become spiritual understanding. And as these instinctive performances gained depth, they became containers for a deeper truth, one that would reveal itself more clearly as the sacred message began to form in the most desperate moments of their existence. In the middle of starvation, fear, and uncertainty, something emerged that was far greater than instinct alone. It was not just about finding food anymore. Early humans began to sense that these recurring patterns, the return of prey, the sudden appearance of danger, the moment when everything felt still just before something dramatic occurred, were not random. They felt like messages, sacred, unspoken, impossible to prove, yet impossible to ignore. These weren't hallucinations from hunger. They were internal realizations, shaped by generations of observation, pain, and the need to give meaning to what couldn't be controlled. At night, when the fire dimmed and the sky above stretched endlessly with stars no one understood, small groups sat close, eyes reflecting the flames. Elders pointed toward the darkness, recounting the moment a strange bird flew overhead, and 2 days later, a bison herd arrived. Or the time a child dreamt of water, and the next morning, after digging near a tree, a muddy spring opened. These memories were shared in whispers, as if louder voices might scare away the meaning. Over time, the stories turned into warnings, and the warnings became messages believed to come from something sacred, not a god, but an essence, a force, an invisible presence that watched, nudged, guided. The hunger, which seemed like a curse, became the gateway. It opened their minds to signs. Not everyone could read them, but those who could were seen differently, not as stronger, but as more in tune with what surrounded them. Their silence had meaning. Their intuition was respected. They were the ones who would pause the hunt, change the direction of migration, or decide to abandon a place that felt wrong. They had no proof, only a knowing. And more often than not, they were right. These sacred messages were not always hopeful. Sometimes they came with death. A sudden unease in the air. A quiet animal vanishing too soon. They began to notice that the natural world responded to something deeper, the kind of change that only hunger revealed. For early humans, surviving meant listening not only to their bodies, but to something beyond themselves. These signals were sacred because they repeated. They aligned with outcomes. And slowly, the idea formed that the world was speaking to them, that it always had been. In the deepest moments of scarcity, when days without food piled into weeks, a strange kind of clarity often emerged among early human groups. It was during these extreme phases that something unlike pure instinct appeared, a presence, a sensation, an undeniable message felt in the very core of their being. This was not a hallucination, though their bodies were weak. Nor was it simple fear, though danger lurked everywhere. This was something else, a sacred message, not spoken aloud but pressed into their awareness like a whisper that came from beyond. The message didn't come with words. It arrived as a shift in perception, a pull in a certain direction, a sense that the group needed to leave now or that they should stay hidden longer. Sometimes it was a dream shared by more than one person, or a sudden, powerful silence that overtook them all at once. These were not coincidences to them. These were signs, warnings. And more than that, they were interpreted as guidance, not just from nature, but from something sacred that lived within and around them. When the youngest child in the group stopped crying and stared into the distance, the elders paid attention. When the same animals returned to the same field at the same time 2 years in a row, the memory was etched into the minds of everyone. And when someone felt a powerful need to take another path, one they couldn't explain, and it led them to safety, that story became sacred. It was told again and again, each time with more weight, more reverence. This was the beginning of something larger than survival. It was the beginning of meaning. They began to see hunger not as punishment, but as a signal, not as a weakness, but as a spiritual opening. The absence of food thinned the barriers between the physical and the invisible. In those fragile moments, they believed they were able to receive messages, warnings, instructions, or truths that were not visible during normal times. They didn't speak of gods, but of presences. They didn't chant prayers, but repeated movements that seemed to invite clarity. In this sacred vulnerability, they discovered something profound. The hunger for food had awakened a hunger for understanding, and that hunger revealed knowledge beyond logic. And now, I want to know what you think about this. Do you believe that moments of extreme vulnerability can open doors to something deeper? Have you ever experienced a moment where everything around you felt like a message meant only for you? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear your perspective. Your experience might help others recognize their own invisible signs. Let's continue this journey and see how those early humans began to organize their lives around the rituals of survival and sacred meaning. As the sacred message began to take shape within the fabric of early human experience, it was not kept in silence. It moved. It flowed. It traveled through stories etched into memory, passed down not with words, but with repetition, in action, in rhythm, in choice. Hunger didn't just shape the individual, it forged collective behavior. What worked once became custom. What saved a group became a law. These unspoken traditions became the vessels for sacred memory, and from them emerged a structure that would guide human communities for generations. In the absence of written records, their understanding of the sacred was preserved in the way they prepared food, in the silence they held before a hunt, in the direction they faced when building fire. These were not coincidences. These were signals of something larger, patterns that formed the architecture of survival, encoded with meaning. The youngest learned by watching. Children mimicked without knowing why they crawled in a circle before stepping into a cave, or why they touched a tree before walking into the plains. The elders didn't always explain. They didn't need to. The actions were the message. What once came as a whisper in a moment of desperation was now woven into daily life. And through this weaving, the sacred message became part of the social body. But the message wasn't static. It evolved with time and necessity. As groups moved to new territories, they adapted the rituals to new landscapes. But the core intention remained, to stay alive and to remain in harmony with the unseen. The hunger that had once triggered the first spiritual impressions now became the foundation for collective intuition. A sense of alignment grew, not with gods, not yet, but with something that lived in the space between nature and human awareness. This unseen presence was trusted because it had proven itself again and again in the most desperate hours. Even in scarcity, there was ceremony. When a small catch fed an entire group, it wasn't consumed in chaos. There was order, a sequence, an offering, sometimes to fire, sometimes to the land, and sometimes to what they believed watched from the sky. These acts were not decoration. They were survival. They honored the invisible bond they believed kept them from falling into total despair. Through this silent agreement, the group strengthened not only its chances to live, but its sense of unity, a unity bound by memory, rhythm, and shared reverence for the intangible. As time unfolded, the message carried by hunger transformed into a compass of sorts, pointing not just toward food, but toward a way of being. It showed them when to rest, when to move, whom to trust, and when to listen. And they listened closely. Every change in the wind, every shift in animal behavior, every cloud pattern over the mountains held potential significance. Hunger had opened the door, but it was memory, deep, embodied memory that kept the door from closing. And in the next movement of their story, this memory would be tested by fear, by loss, and by the need to read messages not just in the world, but in the very air around them. Food was not just nourishment in the prehistoric world. It was a force that shaped the emotional and spiritual architecture of early human life. As the body yearned for sustenance, the mind sought patterns, meaning, and symbols that could offer a sense of order in a world dominated by unpredictability. Hunger carved deep grooves into their memory, and within those grooves, certain behaviors and beliefs began to crystallize. Over time, these repeated experiences formed internal maps, pathways of understanding that connected struggle with revelation. Each foraging expedition was more than a search for calories. It became a ritual of observation, trial, and silent negotiation with the environment. The appearance of a specific animal after a storm, or the smell of a certain tree before a successful hunt, became more than coincidence. These events were interpreted as omens, indicators that the world was responding to their hunger. They believed that their actions, the way they moved, how they treated the land, the rhythm of their footsteps, could influence these outcomes. This belief was not superstition. It was an early form of cause and effect rooted in emotional logic and reinforced by necessity. Hunger also generated unity. In moments when all bellies were empty, early humans began to form bonds not just for protection, but for shared meaning. They told stories, not as entertainment but as survival tools. These stories encoded knowledge about dangerous paths, safe routes, deadly seasons, and miraculous recoveries. And, gradually, the language of these tales included something else: sacred implications. The cave where food was found after 7 days of drought was no longer just a place. It became a sign. The animal that wandered into their circle just as a child was about to die from weakness was not simply meat. It was a messenger. Over generations, these moments created layers of spiritual understanding that were directly tied to hunger's rhythm. These shared experiences led to patterns of behavior that repeated across time and space. Groups separated by miles of terrain began to display eerily similar rituals. They danced before hunts, offered pieces of meat to fire, and touched their foreheads to stone. These acts did not emerge from a rulebook, but from hunger's deep emotional resonance. The desperation to find food opened the door to meaning, and once meaning entered, it never left. Instead, it grew. It was passed on not through words, but through actions, repetition, and emotional intensity. Thus, hunger gave birth to symbols, and symbols evolved into beliefs. The spiritual layers encoded in their behavior were not arbitrary. They were born from the same pain, the same longing, the same need to understand why some survived and others did not. As this structure deepened, it began to spread across generations, embedding itself in the DNA of culture, waiting to be uncovered again, not just by archaeologists, but by anyone willing to listen to the silence beneath survival. Knowledge in those ancient days was not written, and it was never shouted. It was carried in the body, in the repetition of movements, in the echo of a gaze passed from elder to child. The most important truths were not taught. They were lived, and because of that, they endured. In an age where memory was the only library, the sacred messages born in hunger were preserved not through explanation, but through imitation. A young hunter watched the precise way an elder paused before crossing a bow valley. A mother noted how her grandmother waited 3 days after a storm before returning to the river. No one questioned these actions. They simply absorbed them, as if something older than logic demanded their continuation. This was the essence of early transmission: silent, embodied, and sacred. And the hunger that shaped these patterns also ensured their survival. Because when the stakes are life or death, repetition is not just tradition, it is preservation. The messages encoded in these, Behaviors were not treated as optional. They became laws written in movement, in timing, in posture. And over time, they became part of the invisible code that linked generations, even when the individuals themselves were long forgotten. The earliest humans did not sit in circles and explain philosophy, but they performed philosophy. They responded to the invisible. They learned to trust signals that made no sense but often led to salvation. And as each generation handed down these rituals and behaviors, they added new layers, new interpretations based on fresh struggles. A different predator, a new drought, a scar on the land caused by fire. The lessons of the past were reshaped, but the structure of transmission remained intact. Do as I do, because doing otherwise might lead to death. And so, even without knowing it, early humans created the first foundations of culture. Not a culture of art or music, those would come later. This was a culture of survival saturated with meaning. A culture where lighting a fire in a specific pattern meant something beyond utility. Where sleeping with the head pointed west was not superstition, but inherited wisdom. And where hunger was not a shameful weakness, but a signal that the world was testing them, asking them to listen more carefully, to act with greater intention. What emerged from this quiet system of transmission was a deep, almost unbreakable continuity. Even when groups were scattered or lost, even when landscapes changed and dangers shifted, the core behaviors remained. They remained because they worked. But more importantly, they remained because they felt right. They resonated in the bones. And within that resonance lived the sacred message, the same message that hunger had revealed and that memory refused to release. As this chain continued, something even more complex began to take shape. The idea that not only the world, but time itself was speaking. That the past was alive inside the present, guiding them forward without ever saying a word. At times, survival for early humans depended not on strength or numbers, but on something less visible, the ability to read what wasn't there yet. They couldn't afford to wait until a storm came to seek shelter, or until predators circled to find an escape. They had to act before, and to do that, they relied on presages, silent warnings, sudden feelings, patterns in the wind, or shifts in the behavior of animals. These signals weren't obvious to everyone, but those who noticed them and trusted them often became the ones others followed. Over time, the group learned to value these individuals not only as leaders, but as receivers of something sacred. These premonitions were not labeled as visions or miracles. Instead, they were treated as part of the normal experience of life. A child refusing to step into a certain cave might cause the entire group to stop. An elder waking suddenly and insisting they take another route would not be questioned. These instincts were honored, not because of fear, but because they aligned with an understanding that something larger was guiding them, something that had no name, yet was constantly speaking through signs. Many of these signs emerged from repetition. If every time a certain bird flew low over the trees, a storm followed, it became a message. If a certain silence came before an animal attack, that silence was remembered. And through this pattern recognition, early humans began to create an internal catalog of warnings. These were passed on through mimicry, story, ritual, and rhythm. But there was something more profound beneath all of this. The feeling that the world itself was alive with intention, and that it whispered instructions to those who had the courage to listen. In their most fragile moments, when hunger twisted their bellies and sleep was no longer possible, their minds opened to a different type of perception. They didn't think in sentences or debate, logic. They felt. And those feelings became maps. The sacred message wasn't a sentence carved in stone. It was a series of moments, fragments of intuition held together by emotional gravity. Some called it knowing. Others called it remembering. But none of them doubted it. The mind of a human under constant hunger is not the same as the mind at rest. It bends, stretches, sharpens, and sometimes fractures. For early humans, this was not a temporary condition. Hunger was a defining feature of existence, and over time, it left a permanent imprint on their mental and emotional architecture. It wasn't only about pain or discomfort. The unending scarcity sculpted the very structure of how they perceived danger, opportunity, memory, and meaning. And from this mental crucible emerged not just survival strategies, but the first glimpses of belief systems, crude, evolving, and deeply psychological. As their bodies weakened, their minds often became more alert. The lack of food pushed them to see more, hear more, remember more. They noticed the smallest irregularities in the environment, because missing one could mean death. But it also meant their brains were constantly flooded with stress. This stress, persistent and generational, produced patterns of thought we now recognize as the roots of mythology, symbolism, and emotional storytelling. Fear and need weren't just reactions, they were creative forces. When hallucinations emerged from starvation, they weren't dismissed. They were interpreted. Visions were taken seriously. A flickering shape in the distance, a whisper heard in the dark. These were not random occurrences to early humans. They were pieces of a puzzle too vast and too sacred to be ignored. And so, the architecture of early belief was not built from calm reflection, but from crisis. Hunger gave birth to intense emotional experiences, and those experiences demanded interpretation. It was no longer enough to eat and live. They needed to explain why they had lived at all. These explanations often took form in simple, repeatable stories. Stories that turned suffering into narrative, turning pain into purpose. The cave where no animals had appeared for weeks became a cursed place. The child who dreamed of fire before a lightning strike became a seer. Whether or not these were true didn't matter. What mattered was that they helped the group organize its emotional world. They provided a map, not of territory, but of fear and hope. And these maps helped them continue. The hunger that haunted them also united them. Shared suffering created shared meaning. These early humans were not simply individuals trying to survive. They were emotional networks, passing down not just knowledge, but psychological responses. They began to fear the same things, hope for the same signs, avoid the same dangers. Over time, these collective emotional patterns hardened into belief, not because of dogma, but because of memory. A kind of memory soaked in, hunger, rooted in instinct, but shaped by imagination. This psychological inheritance became just as important as the physical one. Long before the first priest or shaman, long before sacred texts or temples, there was the unspoken understanding that pain had a message, and that message echoed through the minds of those who had lived on the edge. Minds sharpened by fear, opened by need, and quietly convinced that they were not alone. By now, the spiritual codes of early humans were not isolated. Experiences. They had evolved into behavioral blueprints, invisible but powerful forces that shaped how entire groups moved, responded, and survived together. These were not commandments carved into stone, but emotional contracts, deeply internalized and reinforced through repetition, memory, and consequence. They weren't dictated by a leader, but emerged naturally from the collective need to find meaning in a world that refused to explain itself. Patterns of action took on symbolic weight. If one group had been saved after gathering in silence before a hunt, that silence became sacred. If another group had found food after walking 3 days in a straight line, they might never again wander aimlessly. These behaviors hardened over generations into traditions, and those traditions became embedded in the group's very identity. The rituals born from hunger became the architecture of culture, not because they guaranteed success, but because they offered the comfort of order in a reality ruled by chaos. Even gestures carried meaning. A hand placed on a stone before entering a cave, a specific rhythm of walking when crossing open land. These were not random habits. They were part of a silent language that expressed reverence, caution, gratitude, or warning. The people who failed to follow these codes were not scolded. They were feared, because violating the pattern could awaken danger, or worse, attract the unknown forces that had once punished their ancestors. These group behaviors became more than practical. They became sacred. Certain caves were avoided, not because of known danger, but because the memory of loss lingered there. A tree struck by lightning was not just a tree. It was a message. And while modern minds might search for logic, those ancient communities responded with trust. They didn't need to know why the message mattered. They only needed to remember that it did. This memory-based belief system reinforced group cohesion. Everyone played a role. Everyone carried a piece of the invisible message. Even children were not exempt. They were taught the rhythms, the silences, the appropriate reactions to certain signs long before they understood them. And through this collective participation, belief became behavior. Behavior became culture. And culture, for them, was a form of survival. As these sacred codes became embedded in group dynamics, they also created boundaries. Who could be trusted? Who had the gift of perception? Who had broken the invisible rules? These distinctions eventually laid the foundation for roles: the one who dreams, the one who leads, the one who remembers. All of it traced back to hunger, to the moment when a group of desperate humans stared into the void and decided to listen, to act, and to pass on what they felt without ever needing to explain it. 300,000 years have passed, but the whispers left behind by those early humans still echo in ways we rarely recognize. They didn't build monuments or write books. They didn't leave behind golden artifacts or temples carved from stone. But what they did leave was far more intimate, a sacred thread woven into the behaviors, instincts, and emotions we still carry today. This legacy wasn't passed through language. It was transmitted through fear, repetition, hunger, and the longing to understand what can't be seen. The sacred message of those times is not buried under earth or hidden in caves. It is embedded in the way we respond to silence, in the way our bodies react to danger before our minds catch up, in the way we sometimes feel the presence of something guiding us, even when logic fails to explain it. These aren't modern inventions. They are ancient signatures, the survival instincts polished into spiritual intuition by people who lived through terror, loss, and hunger so constant it shaped their biology and their belief at the same time. When they gathered around fires, they weren't just warming themselves. They were performing acts of memory. When they sat in silence before a journey, they weren't wasting time. They were listening, not with their ears, but with something deeper, something that had been tuned across thousands of repetitions. What they heard in that silence, what they felt in that emptiness, was the same thing that still stirs inside us when we sense that a place feels wrong, or that we're being watched, or that we shouldn't ignore a dream that won't go away. Their sacred message was not a prophecy about the future. It was a declaration of presence, a reminder that even in the most desperate conditions, meaning exists, that suffering isn't just pain, it's a lens, that hunger isn't only emptiness, it's a doorway, and that every pattern they uncovered, every ritual they honored, every sign they trusted, was their way of telling us, you are not alone in your confusion. We were confused too. but we found ways to see. If you made it here, it means you feel some part of that, too. So let's turn this journey into something more. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue exploring how human history hides in plain sight, inside our instincts and stories. Leave a like if you felt something move inside you while listening. And write a comment below using the phrase, "The hunger still speaks," just those words, so I know you were here, feeling what they felt. There's a video right beside this one that expands this very topic even further. Click on it and keep walking with me. What we're discovering together isn't over, it's just beginning.